They built a cage in the middle of town, not for a beast, but for a broken woman. In Dust Hollow, justice doesn't wear a badge. It sells tickets. People came with their children to laugh at her, to point at her scars like carnival entertainment. $10 to touch the giant widow, locked in an iron cage. They called her monster, killer, freak. But no one asked what those three men did to her in that alley behind the church. No one wanted to know. Her name was Selene Ward, a war widow, a healer, and a woman who lost everything. They didn't just bury her husband, they buried her dignity, her voice, her humanity. Until one man stopped walking, turned around, and did the unthinkable. He bought her, not to own, not to tame, but to ask one simple, world-shattering question: will you marry me? What kind of man marries the woman everyone fears? And what kind of world turns a rape survivor into public property? Today, we tell a story they tried to erase, a story about rage, about redemption, and about the fire that starts when one person dares to see beyond the bars. Before we begin, hit that like button if you don't like what happened to Selene. Comment 1 if this story already grabbed your gut. Subscribe if you believe no one belongs in a cage, and watch until the end. Because trust me, there's a moment coming that no one saw coming. They didn't keep her behind bars because she was dangerous. They kept her there because they were afraid someone might listen to her. The cage stood in the center of Dust Hollow like a monument to cowardice. Thick, rust-streaked iron bolted to sun-baked wood, as permanent as shame itself. Tourists came from towns over to see the Beast Widow. But if you listened close, beneath the gawking, beneath the dust and children's laughter, you could hear the silence. Her silence. It wasn't submission, it was protest. Selene Ward hadn't spoken a single word in over a year. Not when they chained her. Not when they threw scraps at her feet like she was some half-wild dog. Not even when they paraded her on Sundays after church so the good folk could point and say, "See what happens when a woman forgets her place." But her silence didn't protect her. It made them hungrier. People don't hate monsters. They hate mirrors. And Selene? She reminded them of everything they did to women who didn't break the right way. She hadn't always been the town's shameful secret. Before the war stole her husband and the peace stole her name, she was a battlefield nurse. The kind who pulled bullets out of boys younger than her little brother. She'd stitched limbs in rain and blood, held the dying until they stopped screaming. She carried more honor in her calloused hands than the entire town council combined. But honor means nothing when your truth makes powerful men uncomfortable. They said she snapped. That she ambushed 3 local men. Good men, they insisted, despite what they did behind that saloon. The sheriff didn't bother asking why her dress was torn, or why her wrists were bruised like rope had kissed them too long. No trial, no defense, just a cage. And then they built a sign. $10 to touch the beast, $1 just to look. She was no longer a woman. She was a revenue stream. No one visited Selene Ward to hear her story. They came to feel superior, to see pain they didn't have to carry. But that morning, the morning you and Gray arrived, the wind shifted. Literally. A dust storm rolled through the square, choking the sun, and people spat curses as they shielded their eyes. When it cleared, he was already standing there. He didn't flinch, didn't stare, didn't throw anything. He just looked at her like she was human. A child hurled a rock at the cage. It clanged hard off the bars. Selene didn't even blink. But Ewan turned, sharp, precise, and glared at the boy so fiercely the child dropped the second stone in his hand. That was the moment the town stopped whispering and started watching. Something was different about this stranger. Not just his silence, his stillness. Like he'd come with the weight of something deeper than justice. Like he'd already made a decision. He climbed the wooden platform slowly, boots heavy on dry planks, and the sheriff, always bloated and sweating, leaned forward with a smirk. $10 to touch, he said. Ewan reached into his coat and dropped a full pouch of coins onto the sheriff's lap. "I want to buy her," he said. The crowd gasped. That wasn't part of the show. "Buy her?" the sheriff choked. "She ain't no livestock." Ewan didn't blink. "You put her in a cage, hung a price on her. Now I'm paying it." What followed wasn't outrage, it was fear. Fear that the story would change. fear that someone was finally breaking the spell. And for the first time in months, Selene Ward turned her head and looked someone in the eye. She saw something she hadn't seen in over 2 years. Not pity, not fear, recognition. And maybe, just maybe, hope. Yes, well. You could almost hear the moment the town's spell broke, like a thread snapping under too much tension. As the gold coins clinked against the sheriff's splintered desk, something shifted in the air. The onlookers weren't laughing anymore. The absurdity of what Ewan Gray had done, trying to buy the most hated woman in Dust Hollow, was too serious to joke about. This wasn't just defiance, it was war. The sheriff's jaw hung open. "You serious, boy?" Ewan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The weight of the pouch spoke louder than words. One of the councilmen stepped forward, red-faced, trembling with thin outrage. "She's not property. You can't just throw gold and—" "But she's in a cage, isn't she?" Ewan snapped, his voice cool as a loaded revolver. "You made her into property. I'm just paying the price you put on her." For a long, stifled second, no one moved. Then the sheriff, greed sweating from every pore, began counting the coins with shaking hands. 500, he muttered. "That's what she costs." In the back of the crowd, someone shouted, "She killed my brother!" And for the first time in over a year, Selene stood up. The creaking of her joints echoed against the iron bars like a church bell tolling for the dead. She rose slowly, deliberately, unfolding to her full height. The wind caught the hem of her torn dress, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse but clear. "Your brother and his friends dragged me into an alley behind the chapel. They thought because I was a widow, I was alone, powerless." The crowd recoiled, not out of sympathy but discomfort. Truth burns differently than rumor. "I begged them to stop," she said. "I screamed. And when screaming didn't work, I fought." The blacksmith shoved forward, veins bulging. "Liar." "Ask the doctor," Selene said, pointing to the man who'd once patched her wounds and then pretended she didn't exist. "Ask what shape I was in when they dragged me to the jail." Ewan stepped between her and the mob like a wall of flesh and fury. But what truly silenced the square was Selene's last sentence, spoken not as a plea, but a sentence. "They didn't cage me because I'm dangerous. They caged me because I survived." And for the first time, someone clapped. Just one person, an old woman near the back. But it echoed louder than any accusation that day. The applause died as quickly as it came, crushed beneath the weight of angry glares. The old woman who dared to clap was pulled back by her daughter, who whispered something about not inviting trouble. But the damage had already been done. One person had seen Selene as more than a beast. That was enough to tilt the balance. Still, no one moved to help her. No one offered a blanket, a kind word, or even a look that wasn't coated in disgust or fear. The townsfolk wanted the show to end, but not like this. Not with the villain standing tall, telling the truth out loud. The sheriff, realizing the silence was becoming dangerous, fumbled with the cage keys. His fingers shook so hard he dropped them once, twice, before unlocking the door with a metallic click that echoed through the square like a gunshot. Selene didn't step out immediately. She stared at the open door for a long moment, as if suspecting it was a trap. After a year behind bars, freedom doesn't feel like sunlight. It feels like disbelief. When she finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. One foot outside the cage, then another. The ground under her boots felt unreal. Ewan stepped forward, his face unreadable, though his hand was outstretched like a question. Selene looked down at it, then at the crowd, still circling, still watching, eyes narrow with hate. "You still want to marry me?" she asked, her voice low, almost mocking. He nodded once. "Yes," she scoffed bitterly. "Even after hearing the worst of me?" He didn't flinch. "Number I heard the worst done to you. There's a difference." It was that sentence that cut through the last of her defenses. She reached for his hand, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because no one else had ever reached back when she was falling. He helped her down from the platform with a kind of quiet reverence, as if touching something sacred and wounded at once. The moment her boots hit the dirt beside his, the square shifted. People started backing away. Parents pulled children closer. A man near the saloon spit in the dust. "She's gonna slit your throat in your sleep, stranger," someone called out. Selena didn't respond, but Ewan did. "I sleep just fine," he said. "You all do the killing in daylight." They began walking side by side. The crowd parted like oil from fire. And just as they reached the edge of the square, the blacksmith lunged. A roar went up from the crowd as steel flashed in his hand, a jagged scrap of metal, not a knife but sharp enough. He went for Selene, not Ewan, as if wounding her would undo the truth she'd told. But Ewan moved like instinct. His shoulder slammed into the attacker's chest, throwing the man to the ground. The blade skittered across the dirt. The sheriff barked a command, and two deputies wrestled the blacksmith away. But no one apologized. No one acknowledged what had just happened. Selene looked at Ewan, breath catching in her throat. "Why?" she whispered. He dusted off his coat. "Because you didn't deserve that. Because none of this was justice." And then, in the middle of the square that once caged her, he pulled out the ring again, dirt-smudged but still gleaming. "I'm still asking." Selene looked at the ring, then at the people who'd thrown stones at her, the ones who still would. Her voice was hoarse, almost gone. But what she said next was as sharp and shocking as a shot in church. "Yes." The square fell into stunned silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Someone cursed, someone else cried. But Selene only looked at Ewan, eyes not full of love, not yet, but something just as dangerous: belief. Selene had barely said yes when a rock flew past her face. It missed by inches, but the message was clear. Forgiveness was not part of the script. The crowd that once shouted for blood now stood stunned, betrayed by her answer. She was supposed to shrink. She was supposed to break. Instead, she chose to belong to no one but herself. Ewan stepped in front of her instinctively, but Selene pushed forward. She stood on her own, ring on her finger, chin lifted. No one cheered this time. No one clapped. What they'd just witnessed wasn't redemption. It was rebellion. "We leave now," she whispered to Ewan, "before they find their pitchforks." He didn't need convincing. The blacksmith's attack had shown the crowd what they were capable of, and mobs? They never needed a second chance. The two of them walked to his horse, tethered to a post just beyond the church where Selene had once tended war wounds and prayed for mercy that never came. She mounted without hesitation, her hand tight on the pommel, body tense like a drawn bow. Ewan climbed in front of her. Her arms encircled his waist, not out of affection, not yet, but out of need, the need to survive. They rode fast, the hooves of the gelding kicking up a storm of red dust. Behind them, the town of Dust Hollow began to howl. Angry shouts rose into the wind. Doors slammed. One man loaded a rifle, but the sheriff did nothing. He'd already been paid, and more importantly, he'd already lost control. Whatever happened next, he wanted no part in it. As far as he was concerned, Selene Ward was no longer his problem. The desert opened wide around them, barren but beautiful, like Selene herself. The sun dipped low, casting the canyon in long shadows. Ewan didn't speak for nearly an hour. Neither did Selene. Words felt useless when the weight of everything unsaid sat like thunder between them. Finally, when the town was nothing but memory behind them, Ewan asked the question that had been burning in his throat. "Why'd you say yes?" Selene didn't answer immediately. The silence between them wasn't cold, but it was heavy. Her voice, when it came, was raw and low. "Because no one's ever asked me anything without expecting to own me. Not since Robert died." Robert, her husband, the only man who had seen her strength as something to honor, not tame. The man who called her his Athena, with pride in his voice. The man who bled out in her arms after a wound too deep to sew. "When you reached for me," she continued, "I didn't see pity in your eyes. I saw a question. That was enough." Ewan looked over his shoulder at her. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, "but that's why I said yes." They rode into twilight like ghosts, shedding flesh, past cacti and ravines, toward the ridgeline where Colorado territory stretched wild and forgiving. But the past clung to Selene's shoulders like a second skin. She could still feel the iron bars, Still hear the crowd laughing as they sold pieces of her soul for $10 a touch. Still remember the doctor who stitched her shut in silence. She wasn't free yet. She was simply outside the cage. As the last light faded, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a dry riverbed. Ewan pulled the horse to a stop. "We'll rest here," he said. "There's a stream not far. I'll make a fire." Selene dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. She didn't ask for help. She never did. But when she saw him pull off his coat and place it on the ground for her to sit, something in her chest cracked. A small thing. Barely noticeable. Not love. Not yet. But a fracture where light could eventually get in. They sat in silence as the fire came to life. The crackle of flame, the hush of wind through brush, the breath of something ancient and healing. Selene stared into the blaze, then whispered, "Do you believe in second lives?" Ewan poked the fire with a stick. "Number. But I believe in starting over." She nodded. Then, slowly, Selena took the ring off her finger, the one Ewan had given her, and turned it in the firelight. "Doesn't fit quite right," she said. "Too small." "We'll find a better one," he said. "No," she replied, eyes still on the fire. "It's not the ring. It's me. I've never belonged to anything soft." Ewan didn't argue. He just handed her a tin cup of warm water. And in that moment, it wasn't comfort she felt. It was safety, something she hadn't tasted since the day Robert died. Selene didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay beside the fire, wrapped in Ewan's coat, her eyes fixed on the stars above the canyon. It wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was memory. Every time she blinked, the flames reminded her of torchlight. The wind in the grass became murmurs behind a locked door. Even the silence was a kind of violence. When your body remembers being hunted, peace doesn't come quietly. It arrives like an apology from a man who never meant it. But sometime before dawn, she felt something shift. Not in the air, but inside her. She wasn't in a cage. Not anymore. And that realization, whispered like a ghost across her chest, finally let her rest. By morning, they were already riding again, west through shale hills and dry creek beds, the horse moving steady beneath them. By noon, they reached the edge of Pine Ridge, a mountain town small enough to be forgotten by the world, but big enough to hold a church, a general store, and a secret. Selene dismounted, boots crunching over gravel, her jaw tight. She hadn't entered a church since Robert's funeral, and back then, they'd made her sit alone in the back pew like her grief might infect the others. Now she would walk down the aisle again, not as a widow, but as a witness to her own survival. The preacher didn't flinch when he saw her. Old, gray-bearded, wearing spectacles that caught the light like halos, he simply asked, "Is this a runaway wedding or a resurrection?" Ewan smiled. "Maybe both." They said their vows with no music, no audience, no flowers, just the scent of beeswax candles and worn pine wood. Selena wore her same torn dress, but this time she wore it like armor. Ewan stood beside her in trail-stained clothes and dusted boots, one hand steady on hers the entire time. He didn't shake. He didn't flinch. He meant every word. When the preacher asked if they would cherish one another, Selene almost laughed. Cherish? No one had used that word for her since before the war, since before men had treated her strength like a threat and her silence like guilt. But when she looked at Ewan, she saw something unspoken in his eyes. Not rescue, not reward, respect. "I do," she said, voice rough but clear. Ewan repeated it, slipping the ring, still too tight, back on her finger. The preacher declared them husband and wife, and then, without hesitation, Ewan leaned in and kissed her. Not with hunger, not with claim, but gently, like she was a name worth remembering. That night, they stayed in a room above the general store. Simple, with white curtains and a creaky bed. Selene stood by the window for a long time, watching the mountain turn gold in the setting sun. She hadn't unpacked. She hadn't cried. She hadn't moved much at all. She was still waiting for someone to knock on the door and take everything away again. Ewan sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots, giving her space. "You don't have to stay," she said suddenly. He looked up, quiet. Neither do you. She turned from the window, eyes sharp. I'm not good at being soft. I'm not asking you to be, he said. I just want to know who you are when you're not surviving. Selene walked over slowly, sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. And for the first time in years, she didn't flinch. I used to paint, she said. Back before the war, before Robert. Ewan blinked. You? I liked faces, she added, voice almost a whisper. Not because they're beautiful, because they hide so much. He smiled. You'll paint again. Maybe, she said, then paused. If I remember how. He turned to face her fully. If you forget, I'll remind you. There was no need for more words. Just that promise, sealed in the quiet, held between two scarred hands, learning how to hold each other without breaking. Outside, the town moved on. Distant hooves, a church bell ringing. Somewhere, someone laughed. But inside that small room, a new life was beginning. Not free of pain, but no longer ruled by it. Selene leaned against him, not to collapse, but to share the weight. They didn't speak of the cage again that night, because for the first time in years, she wasn't defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she chose next. The story of Selene Ward and Ewan Gray reminds us that survival is not weakness. It's a form of rebellion. In a world that tried to define Selene by what was done to her, she chose instead to define herself by what she could still choose: dignity, truth, and the quiet courage to stand back up. Too often, society punishes the wounded more than it does the wicked. Selene wasn't caged because she was a monster. She was caged because she refused to be one. Her strength, her silence, her refusal to apologize for surviving violence became a threat to those who built their power on fear. Ewan didn't save Selene. He saw her. And sometimes, that's all it takes to begin healing: a witness. A hand that doesn't grab but offers. A voice that doesn't speak for you but stands beside you. This story challenges us to re-examine how we treat those who don't break quietly. It asks, when someone stands up and speaks truth in a language shaped by pain, will we call them dangerous, or will we call them human? Redemption isn't granted by towns or governments. It's reclaimed by the soul. And healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means choosing to build something stronger from the wreckage. Selene Ward teaches us that being broken doesn't mean being beyond repair. It means you're still alive. And as long as you're still alive, you still get to choose what comes next.